In terms of RC racing, there are a few names as prolific as Team Associated. They are pretty much the undisputed kings of 10-scale off-road racing, beginning with their beloved 10-scale RC10 two-wheel drive buggy. 8-scale, however, is very much a different animal. So how have they been doing in that department? Well, if you look at them from a purely race standing position, not too great. Lots of their drivers have struggled to make headway as of late in the 8th scale, and as a response, Associated have gone back to the drawing board and come back with this, the new RC8 B4e. Coming in with a new design from pretty much the ground up, will this new buggy be enough to put Associated back on the map in 8th scale world? Why don't we find out together? Before we begin, however, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to like the video and comment what you think of the new buggy from Associated. Without further delay, this is my experience with the RC8 B4e. Since this is the first time I have built an 8-scale buggy, I expected to run into a few issues going in. However, I must say I was pleasantly surprised by the ease of which this buggy went together. The only issue I had was pretty much my own cheapness and lack of proper tools. When it comes to 10-scale rigs like buggies and trucks, you can get away with using subpar tools most of the time. It may not be ideal, but it can be done. This is not the case with 8-scale rigs. It's pretty much MIP or better or bust. This is for two main reasons. The first one being the chances of stripping your tools on these screws, especially those ball scup screws, is extremely high. Second, using simple hand tools on your 8-scale racing rig is possible, especially if those tools are high quality. However, if you value your time and body, grabbing an electric driver for those builds is extremely imperative. Another thing to note about the build itself is that the black grease is going to be your absolute best friend, especially for getting things like turnbuckles and pillow balls into their specific holes. Other than that, the instructions were pretty standard for Team Associated. They were simple to follow and easy to understand. There weren't any mistakes in the actual instruction manual I could personally see, and the fit and finish of everything seemed to be good enough for the most part. Overall, the build seemed to be pretty standard as 8-scale kits go. Nothing wrong with that though, it just means less surprises. In terms of the actual design of the B4e, it seems as though they've gone the route of X-ray and that all of the weight is as close to the middle as possible, and said weight is as low as possible. The standard battery configuration, the one recommended by Associated and the one listed in most of their official setup guides, is the twin 2S shorty pack setup, so that's the one I built. Compare this to the other 8-scale car that uses this configuration, the Kyosho MP10e. See how the batteries are very far out on the sides and spread the weight out to make it stable? The Associated went the other way around and put the weight as close to the center as possible to make the car rotate better in corners. We'll have to see how that pans out on the track. Now I could sit here and explain everything that is different from this B4e to the old B3e, but we'd be here for a little while, so what I'm going to do is tell you that the B4e and its predecessor, the B3.2, are very different from one another in design, adjustability, and feel on the track. We'll get to that last part in a bit. Anyway, most of the changes done to the buggy from the last gen buggy to this one seem to be in the name of flexibility, mostly literally. The arms are adjustable in terms of their stiffness and their molds have been changed in order to cater to this increased flexibility. Another side effect of having a more flexible car is because they're more flexible, they're much more durable. It's also important to note that the car uses a pillow ball setup as well. With that summary out of the way, why don't we see this thing drive? Now, it's important to note that the only car that I have to actually compare this to would be my old 2019 X-Ray XB8 that I had last year. It's mostly a comparison between a saddle pack setup versus a traditional stick pack, and I've got to say, the saddle pack seemed to be at the very least more maneuverable. I'm able to make better adjustments in the air than previous buggies I've driven, and I had very little issue getting the rear end to come around in a corner. Overall traction coming out of a corner was so long as I was able to match the tires to the track conditions was pretty good as well. That doesn't necessarily mean it was easy to drive though. Even though the car was quick and could pull quick lap times if driven well, sometimes I had a hard time actually making that happen. I chalk this up to me being more or less a novice when it comes to 8th scale racing, but this isn't entirely the case as I'm not the only one to have this opinion. More on that later. Whereas the B4e will change direction on dime, it's nowhere near as stable or as easy to drive as the previous gen car, the B3.2, or even other 8-scale buggies I've driven like the Kyosho MP10e or the Hot Bodies 8-scale buggy. This could be because of the numerous changes they made to keep the center of gravity as close to the center of the car as possible to help the car in rotation. Once again, this is good for performance as this means you can change direction much quicker. However, for beginners to the 8-scale part of racing, this could be an issue. So much so that I already hear talks of them working on a B4.1 to make it easier for new drivers to, well, drive. Now I've also heard talks about a slight mod to the diffs to make the car more drivable. What's the mod to the diffs, you ask? Having them reversed. According to a team driver named Brian Looper, this causes the front to stay more level under hard acceleration, keeping the car more stable at high speed. Now in order to actually do this, you need to make some modifications to the actual chassis. Now, I don't expect you guys to do this to actually tame the car. What I will say is that I'm curious as to why Associated didn't run the reverse front and rear diffs in the first place. From what I can see, it allows the car to be much more stable and makes it easier to drive. If you have the answer as to why they didn't do this from the start, be sure to put it in the comments below. One of my patrons, Morrison Wad, actually did this modification and ended up a couple seconds a lap quicker than box stock. I will say though, this local track is usually very bumpy and very dusty. This sort of leads me to my next point. Everyone I've talked to about how the B4e performs compared to the old B3.2 have mentioned either how well the car rotates or how difficult it is to drive at the limit. For me, it really depended on what kind of surface I was driving on. With the stock-ish setup, I'm running a very loose center diff by the way, the car is very difficult to drive on a non-grooved, loamy, or even extremely dusty track, even with the correct tire setup. However, when the track is a little bit less dusty or especially grooved, all of the things that made it unpredictable make it a dream to drive on the smooth stuff. This has been my personal experience with the buggy for the amount of time that I've had it, which is honestly not that long. Overall, the buggy performs as expected from a new Associated kit. They seem to have this idea that everyone runs on really well swept and groomed surfaces and as such, tune their cars out of the box to perform well on those surfaces. Whether or not this is a good strategy is up to you as a customer and how close you are to a well-groomed track. Next up we have good old-fashioned durability. This is where an 8-scale buggy is expected to excel. In the amount of time I've been able to drive this thing at the two main tracks in Georgia, being Loganville RC Complex and the Barn RC Raceway, in my very first run of the actual buggy, I had a body mount malfunction where the admittedly tiny screw that holds the front body mount on backed out on a particularly bad nose landing on a jump I failed to clear. On my second run, things were going pretty good all things considered, until the last lap of my qualifying heat when the screw that holds the turnbuckle on the actual steering knuckle had backed out. This one, to be brutally honest, was my fault as I didn't use enough Loctite to keep it on securely. On my last run of the day, another piece of hardware backed out. This time, it was the screw that holds the steering rack in place. Once again, this one was my fault as I hadn't used enough Loctite to keep it in place securely. After checking all the hardware on the buggy and re-Loctiting everything, I took it to an arguably more taxing track called Loganville RC Complex. This time, after some really bad crashes, the B4e held together pretty nicely throughout the event. Me being me though, I decided to push my luck after the event was done and had a friend of mine run my car to see how it felt, and in seeing him drive, I forgot that his car was sitting in the middle of the back straight. You can probably see where this is going. My car ended up rear-ending his, which is another B4e by the way, at what had to be at least 40 plus miles an hour. My car ended up coming out relatively unscathed save for a broken arm. His, on the other hand, didn't fare so well. Not only was the rear shock shaft bent, but the whole rear diff case was cracked. Once again though, I highly doubt any car could survive this kind of crash. The fact that my car only walked away with a broken arm is nothing short of a miracle. To be honest though, there isn't much I can actually say about the durability of this buggy. Partially because I haven't had it for too long, also partially because of each of the breakages that I've had were either within reason, as in full speed into another stationary object, or my own lack of build efficacy, but mostly because it's an 8-scale buggy. These things were designed to take a beating far beyond reason because they're regularly put under stress far beyond reason. If anything does break in a crash that really shouldn't have, I'll be sure to post it in my community tag on my channel. In conclusion, Since this is the first 8th scale buggy I've built from scratch myself, there isn't really much I can do to compare it to for the most part, other than perhaps that X-Ray XB8 I had back in 2020. Even then, it's not exactly a fair comparison since they are so different, and the last time I drove that buggy was a long time ago at this point. Since this buggy is probably going to be picked up by a lot of beginners to the 8th scale racing world, I will say this: if you do buy this buggy, make sure to build it with a setup that will work for your track out of the box and go from there instead of running the stock setup. This may not be necessary if you're perhaps running on a well-groomed track or something like that. However, if you're not, I'll leave a few setups in the description of this video to help you get started from other drivers who are probably better at making setups than me. All in all, this is a good buggy. It may not be the easiest to drive out of the box, but the utterly ludicrous amounts of part and track support for this platform already makes up for it. That's all for now. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to comment what you think of this buggy if you have it, or what you thought of the video itself. Any amount of engagement helps. Speaking of which, if you want to help me more directly, be sure to check out my Patreon where I post updates on what new videos will be about. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my patrons Michael Williams, RC World Discord server, Casey Nix, Ben Reeves, Dave Armstrong, Ryan Lamb, Joe Jenkins, Juliet Lovelace, The Mailman 110, Brian Lofton, and especially Morrison Watt. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Alright guys, that time clock has expired. You're going to keep going until the computer calls your name.
Eric Morris done. D. Nice done. Brian Campbell done. Dennis Campbell done. Cameron Johnson done.
Come on, shit!
Greg Jackson done.
Ah!
Done. Martin